Part 2.
Glen McCurley strangled Carla Walker in 1974. Was she his only victim?
2.5 years later, in February 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the famous Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire, and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other killings, the Tower case remained a mystery, though a few days after her murder, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Tower's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Camp Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February 1974. City residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial killer, a fear that law enforcement officials said was unfounded. But such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9, 1984. Davis was found in a field in far south Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19, Marilyn Hartman, a 29-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. A mere 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty pageant contestant, was last seen near Helen Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek bed on the TCU campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26, Catherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after Jackson's killing, Angela Ewart, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. And on the evening of December 22, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been bludgeoned to death. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. An editorialist in the Star-Telegram found more fear by declaring that the recent spate of murders was most likely being carried out by one or more extremely sick persons, consumed by a passion for killing, particularly for killing attractive young women. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect, from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in murders. The killer, if it was one killer, seemed to have retreated. Until February 24, 1986, when a passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket, lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled. But the police couldn't identify her through the usual means, fingerprints or dental records. Nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another. And this time, it really did appear as if the killer had retreated for good. Short of someone showing up at the police department to confess, the detectives were unable to imagine solving any of the Fort Worth killings. But Carla Walker's little brother Jim had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial killers and took courses in abnormal psychology so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. My plan was to get promoted to detective, get my hands on Carla's files, and find her killer, he told me. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local office of defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for Carla's killer. After his father died, in 1987, of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Leighton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother died of Alzheimer's, in 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess, he said. Jim also regularly called the Fort Worth Police Department's cold case unit to ask about developments in Carla's murder investigation. He always got the same answer: "Sorry, nothing new has emerged. We'll let you know when we get a break." When Jim called the unit in January 2018, he was 56 years old and working as a vocational rehabilitation counselor for the state of Texas. His eyesight had steadily deteriorated to the point that he needed a guide dog to help him get around. Jim left a voicemail. A detective named Leah Wagner returned the call. Wagner had joined the department in 2000, first working in a patrol before being named detective in 2013. She eventually was promoted to the homicide division and focused on active cases. But in 2018 she moved to the cold case unit. Some cops have no patience for cold cases. They can't imagine spending their days hunkered down at a desk, poring over barely legible incident reports from years ago, searching for physical evidence that almost certainly no longer exists and looking for witnesses who have moved away, forgotten what they saw, or died. Wagner, however, was intrigued by the work. "Your chances of success are never high, but I love that aha moment when you put the pieces of a puzzle together," she told me. "There's a thrill in figuring out something that up to that point nobody else has been able to solve." Wagner was, at that time, the sole staffer in the cold case unit. When Jim got her on the phone, she admitted to knowing nothing about Carla's case. Jim filled her in and added, "If the person who killed her is still alive, he's got to be getting on in years. Please, we're running out of daylight." Wagner's office, a small, windowless cubicle, adjoined a storage room filled with nearly 1,000 files documenting unsolved murders dating back to 1959. After speaking to Jim, Wagner went looking for Carla's files. They were on a bottom shelf, stuffed into 2 large, brown banker's boxes. She started reading, but she didn't get far. Her supervisors sent her to take over the active cases of a detective who had fallen seriously ill. It wasn't until January 2019, a year after she'd first talked to Jim, that she returned to her cold case job. By then, more files had stacked up on her desk. She asked her supervisors for some help. They had the perfect solution. They sent her a reserve officer named Jeff Bennett. The reserve officers perform various duties for police departments, typically on a volunteer basis. Bennett, a trim, middle-aged man who works in the commercial construction business, had been helping the department since 1997, working mostly nights in the patrol division responding to 911 calls. "I liked my day job, but law enforcement was my passion," he told me. "I felt like it was my chance to make a contribution." Bennett had let his superiors know he was interested in doing detective work. His timing couldn't have been better. He was sent to the cold case unit, where Wagner showed him the Carla Walker boxes. Bennett carried them to his home office and immediately began reading. There were original police reports, an autopsy report, and summations of interviews that detectives had conducted with friends and acquaintances of Carla. He worked obsessively, sometimes through the night, and eventually came up with an exhaustive list of roughly 80 people of interest he thought would be worth re-interviewing. Wagner and Bennett asked Jim and his older sister, Cindy, to come downtown so they could introduce themselves. Jim brought along his guide dog, a black Labrador retriever named Cassie, who lay quietly on the floor as he sat down to talk with the officers. The detectives asked Jim and Cindy if they had any hunches about who might have killed Carla. "We have no idea," Jim replied. Cindy told the investigators she now had 4 grandchildren. "And I'm still scared of letting them out of my sight," she confided, wiping tears from her eyes. "All we want to know is who did it and why." The detectives began a laborious process of tracking down everyone on Bennett's list. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school, to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her murder, which he occasionally reread, a likely sign, said the ex-wife, that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla was murdered. What the detectives needed was physical evidence, and the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the killer's DNA. Since Carla's death, the technology of a DNA identification had not only been developed but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians used freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner and Bennett, Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night of her murder had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians could still turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of Carla's killer. What's more, conducting DNA tests on Carla's clothes could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000, money that was more likely to go towards active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead. But they knew the odds were against them. Then their investigation took an unpredictable turn.
Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff.
He had a neatly trimmed beard and tattoos covering both arms, and he often wore black t-shirts featuring various punk bands. Strange, by the way, is a pseudonym. He prefers to keep his real name private. One day in 2017, he told his wife, Erica, that he planned to create a podcast about unsolved murders in Texas. He said his first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose murder he had read about while poking around the internet. Strange set up some inexpensive recording equipment in a bedroom in his home and began interviewing Jim and Cindy and a couple of Carla's friends. He and Erica wrote the script, and Jim voiced it himself, sounding a little like the horror movie actor Vincent Price, only with a Texas accent. The show, called Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime, had a small audience at first, but one person who did listen to it was Deanne Kuykendall, a retired mail clerk for the U.S. Postal Service in Fort Worth. "I had gone to high school with Carla," she told me. "We didn't know each other at all, but she had always smiled at me in the hallway. She made me feel good, the popular girl talking to someone like me." Listening to the podcast, I thought, I wish there was some way I could pay her back. Kuykendall decided to fly to Nashville to attend Crime Con, an annual 3-day true crime convention that most recently attracted some 5,000 fans, the majority of them women, who flocked to see celebrity authors, podcasters, and broadcasters. She brought along 80 copies of a pamphlet she'd written about Carla's case, which was based mostly on Strange's podcast. She paced the hallways of the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center, passing out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holes, a retired homicide investigator who'd helped solve the Golden State Killer case and who hosted a true crime show on NBC's Oxygen network. "I'm sure everyone thought I was one of those crazy true crime ladies," Kuykendall told me. Holes was intrigued by Carla's case, and in April 2019, his producers called Wagner and Bennett. Oxygen was willing to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. The detectives were thrilled. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid, not on Carla's dress, but on a barely visible stain on the strap of her bra. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Holes and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. Holes devoted an episode of his television show to the failed hunt for Carla's killer, and that seemed to be that. But after the episode aired, Holes introduced Wagner and Bennett to David Middleman, CEO of Othram, a forensic DNA testing lab located in the Woodlands, just outside Houston. Middleman had spoken to Holes about Carla's case, and he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. Because so much of the DNA from Carla's bra strap had been used by the other laboratories in their tests, there was barely enough left to conduct a final analysis. The safe play for Wagner and Bennett would have been to store the DNA and wait for newer technology to emerge. But the detectives rolled the dice. They had their last sample from the bra strap shipped to Othram. The morning of July 4, 2020, Middleman called Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." Bennett began leafing through his binders and took a deep breath. He asked Middleman if anyone in that McCurley family tree was named Glen Samuel McCurley. "Yes," said Middleman, "there's a Glen Samuel McCurley Sr., but he died in 1972, 2 years before Carla's murder." "Was there a Glen McCurley Jr.?" Bennett asked. Middleman said he'd check. He hung up and called Bennett back later that day. There was indeed a Glen Samuel McCurley Jr., and he'd been living in Fort Worth at the time of the killing. Bennett took another breath. Glen McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger .22 had been stolen.